It's 6:36 a.m. on May 11th, 2013, and a very extensively chemtrailed early morning in the Pacific Northwest here on the North American continent, planet Terra. Today's Wujo should really be entitled something like Don't Cry for Us, Woo-Woo. An homage to Argentina. Anyway, the thought was, what if, in spite of all of our minds turning to rather mundane, usual tasks, what if we actually get a global coastal event here in the month of May? You know, it's very difficult. Your mind continuously makes plans for the future, and thinks regular things are going to occur, and you start thinking about, oh, well, I'd better do this tomorrow, and it's going to have a 2 or 3 month maturity date, whatever the project might be. And it's like, oh, wait a second, I'd better rethink that. Do I need to put that energy into this project tomorrow? And in my position at the moment, there are a lot of such projects, some of which I'm working on, that are going to be useful regardless. Without regard to whether the global coastal event happens or not, such as my boat. If it happens, it's going to be a very useful thing, and if it doesn't happen, it'll be a very useful thing. So that's worth working on at the moment. But many of the projects, you think about 3-month maturity date and the potential that there may not be an infrastructure to allow that project to mature. And so it's like, okay, well, you're going to have to wait. You have to postpone that. Does not make sense at this point, given the level of uncertainty that I've got, to put energy into something that assumes the infrastructure that we've got now, the social and economic, etc., will be existent after June 1. That being the case, it's kind of a pain in the ass, really, because your mind constantly, well, there's all these things I need to get done, and yet at the same time, well, many of them, there may be absolutely no point at all. I truly, I hate to use the word hope, because hope always ends in disappointment, but the hope is a specific emotional response that humans have, and I truly hope that there is no earthquake and no global coastal event. True, it means we have to, here in North America, and probably in lots of areas influenced by the Anglo-American Empire, we've got to fight the stupid fascist fuckers, but in their weird-ass mindset that says control, control, control. But, hey, that'd be the good fight. That'd be worth doing. True, if we have the global coastal event, nobody's energies are going to go into fighting fascism. It just won't even exist, because the fascists will be fighting like everybody else for mere survival. So, it's a duality, a dichotomy here, that is divergent at many different levels. And, while it's true that the uncertainty of the moment has a tendency to breed nervousness in my particular position, simply because of earthquakes, and I don't want to have to clean up all the crap that's going to fall down. I don't really worry about our house so much, or our ability to survive afterwards. It's just I've got a lot of things that I need to do, and I just don't need another huge cleanup project. You would not believe what it was like in 2001 when we had the earthquake here. We were cleaning dust for months. Anyway, though, so. But the thinking for today's Wujo was, what if it actually occurs, okay? And the problem for us in discussing that is that it's not a clear-cut situation. For instance, we don't know what would be the proximate cause of a global coastal event. There are some things that are potential, have a high enough potential to be worth considering in my mind here. And one of them is the idea of a meteor. We've had a lot of these fireballs. This makes a lot of sense. Russia got the meteor preview of what was in potential on land, and what if one of those big things smacked into the ocean? Okay, that would cause, or could cause potentially, a number of the symptoms that we've had associated with the global coastal event, especially if the meteor was of sufficient size to trigger volcanic action. I don't see meteor, though, as personally, because we have a simultaneous kind of an event such that there is action in both the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. Now, in near simultaneous fashion. I don't think they're separated by much more than hours. But that would require 2 meteor strikes, highly improbable, but certainly possible. On the other hand, something that would cause that would be a large enough single meteor striking in the southern Pacific Ocean that could then trigger earthquakes that would, for instance, set off tsunamis in the Atlantic. That might function to fit all of the symptoms we've got. Another thing, though, that in my mind has always been the most probable cause is an expansion event. And the expansion events are coincident with changes in the sun. We've had recent changes in the sun. There's all kinds of data in my mind that sets us up, evidence sets us up for a potential expansion event. Now, an Earth expansion event, the Earth expands in the bottom of the ocean. It doesn't expand in continents usually. True, the continents will rip and tear, as we're seeing in Africa and we're seeing all over with the sinkholes. The sinkholes are the first part of a particular kind of a separation within the tectonic plate structure that can lead to tears. So it wouldn't be surprising to learn, for instance, that the Grand Canyon began as a tear, or began as a sinkhole that later on formed out into a tear. But in any event, most of the expansion occurs at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Some at the Atlantic Ocean, but so far, usually southern, in all cases, south of the equator, is the most prominent point of the expansion. Now, this is because we are being drugged behind the sun the way debris is drugged behind a comet. And so most of the sun's gravitational force is on the part of the Earth that is closest or facing to it, which is our northern hemisphere. So there's a magnetic anomaly or asymmetry that has a tendency to form more gravity, if you will, more density in the northern hemisphere. And that's why we find all of the continents in the northern hemisphere. Now, at one point, we were a little tiny planet that was just basically a solid continent with a couple of little lakes on it. When that first started breaking up was when we first started seeing the continents shaped as they are. There have been no new continents ever since that point, but there's been lots of new ocean created. This is an interesting phenomenon. Where the water may come from is open to speculation, whether it's created in the middle of the planet or whether we go through vast clouds of the stuff in space and it condenses, so to speak, in the form of hydrogen hitting our oxygen and forming water due to the influence of electricity at the upper atmosphere, or whether it's micro comets that are basically just, little tiny ice balls that then melt and add water to the atmosphere and so on. It's kind of moot. We just don't know where the water comes from, but it does. And as the oceans have expanded, they've also actually risen. We've seen, for instance, the volume of ocean water at the moment is greater than had existed in several previous ages of the planet, even when the planet was ever so much smaller. So this is a very curious thing. At a time of the last cycle, when the planet was a little bit smaller, we had an inundation that basically overtook parts of India, huge levels of civilization in the Gulf, around also around Cuba, up through the island chains off the coast of North America, and many coastal areas that existed then do not exist now because they're underwater. Sometimes under significant water, 120 meters, or 120 feet, excuse me. No, 120 meters in some of the areas, yeah. So we've got some very large new water, so to speak, even though the planet is expanding. Will we face such a thing now? It could be. There's nothing to rule it out. We have no evidence to suggest that this won't occur. Since we can't say that we know where the water comes from to begin with, that's another issue entirely, then we have to assume that it could reoccur. And because we're in an expansion event, let's just postulate for the moment that water came out in the middle of the planet in the form of hydrogen gas or oxygen that then combines, et cetera, and we get water here on the surface. Because the gas could be kept in a compressed state, we could get a volumetric increase as the stuff occurs here. Or just say, on the other hand, that we're going through an area of space where there's all kinds of hydrogen that impacts oxygen molecules in our upper atmosphere in the form of ripped apart oxygen, ozone, high energy particles come on in, combine it with hydrogen, form the water, and it sort of comes on down in the form of mists, working its way through the chemtrails. Anyway, so whatever the source is, we may indeed face another situation where we have a planetary expansion and oceanic expansion. There is also some small little sliver of evidence from previous cycles that during the period of time of these expansions, the oceans behave oddly, in the sense that it would be predictable, for instance, if the Earth expanded and the volume of water stayed the same, that the water would cover less and less of the planet, and thus our sea level would be falling all the time over the ages. And so we would be migrating our coasts out from an increasing inland area towards very precipitous continental shelves. You know, there's some huge hilly country there on the continental shelves. True, it's all underwater at the moment, but given the idea that the water volume was stable and the planet was not, then it could be expected that the water volume would cover less and less parts of the planet as the planet grew. This is not the case. Why this is not the case is unknown. Lots of speculation from various different fields as to what may be the issue. Doesn't matter, though. We have a practical concern there. So let's just say that the water volume of the planet is going to stay the same, but we're going to have a global coastal event. Let's say that the global coastal event is caused not by a meteor, but by an expansion event, where the planet actually cracks in the Pacific Ocean. And we'll just start it off there and say that somewhere north of the Chatham Trench off of the coast of New Zealand, we get a expansion event that sort of runs in a broad sense towards Hawaii. And this expansion event is really just a big rip in the planet, the way the Banda Aceh earthquake was a symptom of the trenching, the cracking of the Indo-Australian plate. So let's say the Pacific plate cracks. It forms a new crack. It's not very solid. It's full of cracks as it is. And it forms a nice big one. Now, I'm speculating it'll run from the Chatham Rise towards Hawaii, but it could also run the other way from Kamchatka towards Chile. And in either case, the effects would be very dramatic. We would have earthquakes all over the planet as a result of this, maybe severe ones, because local conditions on the other side of the planet, antipodal or in 120-degree trine, so to speak, may be such that there would be major response earthquakes that would be quite large locally. We could also expect that there would be a lot of increase in volcanoes, a whole lot of issues may occur there. Now, let's just assume that there's no huge amount of volcanic intrusion. Well, then if that were the case, then the global coastal event with a large crack like that would include a tsunami of some considerable size, some tsunami force that would be expected to travel around the planet in both directions, depending on where the rip actually occurred, and they'd go around the planet many times. It's known that the tsunami caused by Krakatoa exploding went around the planet 7 times. So we've got that potential there. And that would potentially cause a lot of the symptoms that were reported in the farsight.org, and it would potentially cause a lot of the symptoms that were reported in our global coastal event descriptors from 2003. And potentially would cause the earthquake that was seen in the validation studies that I had commissioned here. So this sort of makes sense. And this is like a mild case, okay? There's not huge amounts of magma intrusion under the ocean. It's just basically a crack in the plate, the way that the Australo-Indus plate cracked around Banda Aceh. And here we would get another crack in the Pacific plate that would be basically, that would be it. Now, we could expect earthquakes for months, maybe even years. We're talking about a very major earthquake associated with the cracking of it. This would have a tendency to cause ripple effects all over. So we would expect to see volcanoes on the increased planet-wide, everything really jittery for a number of years. It may cause ancillary effects like the shifting of Antarctic ice that may just simply break it off rather than disrupt it or anything, they break the ice off in such huge quantities that we get a ocean level impact, because a lot of the ice in Antarctica is either bound to the continent or is, even though it's technically underwater, so it's not floating, even though it is causing displacement. But a lot of it is on continental mass. Now, if any of the ice there or in Greenland shifted, we would be in a situation where those continents themselves would shift as a result of the ice moving. And so the ripple effects could be expected to continue for years, depending on where and how and what's going on. So now let's examine the scenario we have here momentarily for our validation study. It shows that we're going to have a very large earthquake up here, an isolating earthquake. And then one or two participants of that remote viewing validation study also saw water intrusion, but not water intrusion in the form of a giant displacement wave that rolls over mountains and that kind of thing, but rather a creeping water intrusion in the sense of a rising tidal level that simply does not go down. Now, it also showed that there was some distance in time between the earthquake and the water intrusion. We don't know what that distance in time is. Could be hours, days, weeks, months. We just don't know. We do know, though, that it is more likely to be greater than days, just because of some things that are within the validation study itself. We've also had corresponding language in our work that suggested that there would be a reduction, a sucking of water away from the coast that would be followed by, in a tsunami fashion, rising water and coastal damage and so on. Now, our global coastal event was described as taking place over the course of several years. It would take several years from whatever caused it to migrate the water all the way up into places in the Arctic and cause problems up there, especially in the Atlantic side of the Arctic. And so it kind of makes sense that we would have a lag here in water effects up here in the Pacific Northwest of North America if the originating point of the disturbances was in the Southeast Pacific. And so let's postulate a mild case global coastal event in which a crack in the Pacific plate sets off all these other cascading effects of volcanoes, ice shifting, and so on. We get a giant earthquake up here, and then predictably, a number of days, weeks, or months later, we would get water level rise as the effect of the ice shifting off Antarctica and or Greenland was felt here locally. Now, if I actually don't think it's Greenland, because our data set showed Finland being affected by almost 2 years after the Southeast Pacific in our original 2003 through 2006 global coastal event data set as it grew. Now, that would presuppose then that if anything's going to occur, it would be mainly in the southern hemisphere, and it would take a long time to work up to Finland. Okay, so let's say that there is a crack in the Pacific. How could this possibly trigger effects that are seen in the farsight.org study for the Atlantic? Well, one thing is, giant earthquake here could have an antipodal or trine set of earthquakes that would cause El Hierro in La Palma, the volcano there, to shear off about a third of its mass vertically and cause a displacement wave that would head towards the United States from the southeast. It would strike Florida and parts of the Gulf even, and all the way over to Mexico. And it would strike Florida harder than it would other states, and then the level of damage would decrease the further you would go north, and that would account for the level of delta difference in damage between in the Farsight study between Florida and Washington, D.C. And so that part sort of makes sense. And it would be a logical follow-up that a large earthquake in the Pacific would cause planetary levels of earthquakes everywhere else. And it would also fit with the data we've got that shows volcanic issues for us sometime in terms of dust in the air, not Mount Rainier going off or anything like that, and everybody can forget about St. Helens. It's a spent force. Same thing is true of Yellowstone. There's no point in worrying about Yellowstone as a volcano. True, it's a caldera, but it's not a caldera under pressure the way it used to be. Its estimated mass at the time that it blew is 12 times what we've got now. And at the time, there were some 140 active volcanoes ringing the thing. So we don't have any of those conditions now for that caldera to be active. It's much more a sagged out force the way St. Helens is. Not true of Mount Rainier. But in this case, we don't get any indication that Mount Rainier blows, at least not this year. So there we go. There we've got a crack in the Pacific. It ripples around the planet. It causes El Hierro, or it maybe even causes just other earthquakes along the mid-Atlantic ridge that cause tsunamis that affect both coasts of the Atlantic, but more damage towards the North American coast than towards Europe. Now, it is true there's all kinds of damage shown along the coast of Spain, Portugal. Gibraltar takes a big hit. Northern Africa does. This is in our global coastal event stuff. In fact, all of Africa gets a nasty pounding from waves from both sides. Both the Indian Ocean side and the Atlantic side cause problems there. South America is a little different in our global coastal event stuff because there's less problems for Atlantic side South America than there is Pacific side, but even so, the damage on Pacific side South America is limited by the mountain height. So it was not seen as being, yes, there's devastation all along the coast of South America on the Pacific coast side, but the damage was restricted because there was no possibility for the water to run inland any great distance. That's not true in northern South America on the Atlantic side in the Amazonian, northern Amazonian region. However, basically from the, let's say, Guyana south or northern Brazil south, the effects are far less, and they decrease the further south you go. In terms of the damage that was shown in our data sets. Now, this is from the water. There's all kinds of damage that Latin America or South America suffers from rain inundation leading to lahars, giant mud flows. Long run-out slides even occur there that are shown as covering hundreds of kilometers. So there's giant, huge amounts of water that shift all kinds of material off the sides of mountains. And that kind of effect continues. There's also volcanic activity that we had for South America. But in the main, it wasn't hit as hard with the wave action. This is not true of Central America. There was a huge level of damage in Central America, and our data set showed very large portions of the Panama Canal to be blocked, occluded, filled in, cracked, split, this kind of thing. So not a good situation for the canal area. There was enough damage that within our data set that it showed up as being its own separate point of economic impact, if you will. Now, so this is a good situation. This is the mediocre situation in terms of the planet just having a little crack along the Pacific plate, and that's it. But then there's all these ancillary effects insofar as us little humans are concerned. Causes all kinds of problems on nuclear plants all around the planet, shutdowns, blow-ups, this kind of thing. Our data sets had shown that that there were 2 nuclear plants along the coast of California that were in danger from an overwash from a wave action that would scatter them down the beach for a number of miles. We also saw in our data sets that a lot of the what we can think of as the northern eastern corridor has vast quantities of movements of people as a result of the earthquakes and the whatever it is from the Atlantic Ocean that sets off the wave action, because it damages so many nuclear plants in the region, and people flee towards the basically the northwest, and up towards into Canada and so on. This is a result not of regional damage, not of earthquakes, not of buildings coming down, but basically because of nuclear plants run amok. That sort of thing. But it's not ubiquitous. Our data sets didn't go into great levels of detail because of the nature of the data as it was growing over time. You just have to understand what the data looks like to see that we can go a certain level, and then if we wanted to hunt for it, we could probably find the data sets, but usually we just can only go so far, and then we have to pick it up on another screen and move off in another direction as indicated by the data. Probably all an artifact of our programming. but that's just where we are. So remembering that this is all science fiction, in the sense that it's all fiction at this point. The global coastal event has not happened, and we have some quasi-scientific basis for pursuing this, and we're going to explore some science as we go along. But it's basically fiction. When it happens, if it happens, it won't actually manifest as our narrative is suggesting. Because humans like narratives, and we leave out a lot of stuff, we make it nice and neat, and thus we, this is why we like movies. Because there's an ending. It's never as messy as real life, where things just continue. So at this point, here we are. We've had our global coastal event. It's a mild one in the sense that we don't have anything like a major meteor coming on down and displacing vast quantities of water in the southern hemisphere. We just have a bigger version of the Banda Aceh quake, if you will. Now, if we did have a more extreme event, you could see that there would be all kinds of other ramifications. Big meteor throws all kinds of water into the atmosphere, but it also alters the planet itself by adding in that much more mass. And you could have a meteor of such size that the mass of the planet may take hundreds and hundreds or maybe even thousands of years to get itself round again, so to speak. It could cause local distortions at huge levels. Of course, creating areas like the Chesapeake Bay, that kind of thing. Big impacts, Gulf of Mexico kind of issues. So we could have that. That would put huge amounts of water into the atmosphere, may rupture the planet at a deep level and produce new lands from magma coming up, which would, again, displace large amounts of water. Now, we also have in our data sets new lands rising. This has been in there since, 2004. We had specific areas that were cited, 90 east latitude, basically Indian Ocean. And we also had other areas that cited new lands rising in the Pacific. So, I don't think it actually comes from a meteor, because you can also postulate a situation where a major crack in a Pacific plate opens up a vent into some magma. Magma comes roiling on up, creates a giant steam volcano first, and then creates a regular real volcano, which we've got many of them, millions of the buggers under the ocean. And in this case, maybe it's really an existent area of lots and lots of volcanoes. We get a rip along there. All these volcanoes merge into one long-running volcano, and we start producing new lands. Now, it would have two effects. Not only would there be the water displacement as the land comes on in, shoving the water out of the way, which would account for this creeping tidalism kind of description for the water rising that we had had. It would also account for the oscillation of the water levels, because bear in mind, as the magma comes on in, it's going to evaporate vast quantities of water instantly in the form of steam. And we would have a steam volcano that would consume huge amounts of the ocean, assuming that you would have something that would produce a good-sized island. And on its way up, because the island or new land would be a small tip of the pyramid kind of a deal, so you'd have a huge base underneath it that would require the displacement of lots of water, and in the process, the evaporation of lots of water through the action of volcanic heat. This steam volcano that would rise up, let's just speculate that it took 1/1,000,000th part of the ocean, or even 1/100,000,000th part of the ocean, and converted of the Pacific Ocean and converted it to steam. That would still be an increase in the atmospheric levels at 1/100,000,000th part of the estimated volume of the Pacific Ocean water. That would more than quintuple the amount of water vapor currently circulating in the atmosphere. So we'd have 5 times the water vapor in the atmosphere, which would probably start glaciation, certainly would cause all kinds of rain issues and all kinds of flood issues on the existing continents, as the rain decided it was going to come down here and there and so on, given the circumstances. So that would account for some level of the rain flooding we've got in our data sets, as well as in some of the validation studies that happen supposedly after the global coastal event occurs or during the process of it. So let me briefly state that the inland areas of North America, in Canada and Southeast North America, were shown in a couple of validation studies as suffering huge levels of rain. Rain so much that came down in not buckets, but came down in actual lakes, huge lakes that would rain down such that roads were peeled away and big mudslides were created, this kind of a thing. So as we could imagine, a great deal of water. That would fit also, though, with even a mild scenario of a crack in the Pacific Plate, which would increase atmospheric water levels, maybe not quintuple it if there's no huge new land rising or anything, but would certainly increase water levels just in the accelerated level of the volcanoes, which are also spewing out water all the time, by the way, in the form of all these gases that combine. So, and there's also lightning that causes it. You got to see the whole thing. When St. Helens was going off, the atmospheric level of the sensed level of water, relative humidity, varied tremendously during those whole 2 days, the 18th of May through the 20th, as things were going on. Electricity levels were very high, and you'd get literally on one side of your building, you'd have water. It was summer, it was sunny and nice and warm weather. Pre-chemtrail days, and beautiful skies and stuff until the volcano decided to fill them all with ash. But also during that period of time, I noticed that there was condensation in the middle of the day at the hottest temperatures on all kinds of metal of this warm water. And it was just very interesting. We were then at that time we lived 35 miles away from the explosion. So, that's a great distance for those atmospheric levels to be affected. And I had a sling hygrometer, so I was able to do accurate to relative humidity checks. I was just weirded out because it was just fluctuating so wildly. Anyway, so here we go. We have a situation where there's actually a global coastal event. So basically the question is, what happens next? What happens at that point? Well, we don't have any evidence that government comes out and helps anybody. Okay, it doesn't mean government doesn't exist. Government could be hiding in a hole in the ground as far as we know. Doesn't mean that government won't come out and help. Maybe they're just so slow that they don't come out until next year or something. But basically, there's no sign in any of our data sets from 2003 through forever, up until this point. There was never any sign that after the global coastal event, government was existent. We saw a lot of data or a lot of words in our data sets that pointed to the idea of soldiers and others, civil servants and so on, simply abandoning their task and going home. We saw data sets, for instance, that there was no airplane traffic due to crap in the air, volcano, water, whatever. Didn't make any difference. You couldn't fly. But that was good because there were no chemtrails. Of course, it was bad because there was so much volcano ash, you didn't need chemtrails. Our data sets described a situation in which boat traffic became the real norm along the new coast because the coasts were continually shifting. Our data set showed new populations emerging in, let's just call it the Gulf region, that because they were living in a coastal plain and the tidal action was such they couldn't outrun it, they took to living on boats. And that the water level slowly intruded itself up into the Gulf, and it could be that there was subsidence there too. We didn't have anything really to indicate that, but nonetheless, it showed the water intrusion hugely deep into what we now think of as the Southeast or Gulf states. We had and a population, by the way, that existed on these boats that was basically going around scavenging and doing diving on known city sites to recover things. This was also true in a lot of coastal areas around the whole planet, though. We saw that extensively in the Mediterranean, that there was big crack-ups in areas that are much more rocky than they are here in North America. So in the Mediterranean, the water intrusions and so forth were accompanied by a lot of rocky island kind of things falling into the sea, some significant level of subsidence in a couple of small areas, but more an issue of fjord-like creation that then also with a water intrusion covered a lot of the cities. And so, for instance, people were diving on the former site of some famous cities in Italy, as may be imagined, Florence, Venice, and so on, attempting to recover items that were not recovered in the rush to get out. This is all over the planet. We had no indications whatsoever that there was a government coordination. This all appeared from our data sets. In our data sets, we never saw that there was any form of a powers that be organized effort in any of all of this. They may exist. Government may be off doing something, but it's certainly not intruding in the coastal populations that have been so devastated. They're just not seen there. Now, this is also true in the farsight.org study and in the validation studies that we have. Now, this doesn't. We have evidence of absence in the sense that we're showing all of the stuff going on, and you look around in our data, and you look around in the remote viewing stuff, and there's just no sign of any officialdom anywhere. And the word is not there. There's none of the associated language in our sets that come with officialdom or with the powers that be. And they appear to be just simply a non-event or non-issue for the people that are going through the recovery issue of the global coastal event. Now, okay, so that's our basically an understanding of what it takes right up to the immediacy of the global coastal event, and then a few years after, because it takes a number of years, for instance, for these populations in the Gulf region to become self-organizing collectives. It will happen rapidly, but for our data sets, we were looking at maybe a couple of years out when it was very effective, when these self-organizing collectives, these water tribes, if you will, were coordinating themselves into basically a water tribe nation all around that whole area, and had a thriving economy, and were in the process of true recovery from this initial event. Doesn't mean there aren't going to be other events, but these guys were they were getting it together. There was no question. We also saw that in other areas around the planet. Huge levels of water intrusion, as may be expected in low-lying coastal areas such as Bangladesh, India, Southeast Asia. Lots and lots and lots of deaths around the planet were shown in our data sets. 1.289 billion people initially were indicated to die. Now, we don't know how that data or how that number spans time. We don't know. I don't suspect it's going to be the first day. I suspect that's a multi-year death toll. But nonetheless, some years later, and I would say 2 to 5 years later, we show a thriving economic self-organizing collective beginning to spring up around the coastal areas based around the scavenging, but also starting to associate around this, what we called at the time, the new electrics. But we can think of these probably as a new energy forms, all different kinds of new forms of energy. So these are not mutually exclusive. There's apparently some parts of the planet that are doing a whole lot better than North America. There are some parts of the planet that are doing a lot better than Europe. And these would include areas of Africa and great areas of Siberia and northern China, where we saw real creativity booms arising. Now, this is also true in North America. There was something of a renaissance in terms of creativity here, born as a result of necessity. And necessity drives all invention. There is no growth without irritation. No organism moves without being poked. We're going to get poked real hard here, so we become very good at responding to that. It's not a good thing in that sense, but the outcome or the results, we saw good patterns emerging in some of the data sets relative to human-to-human interaction, especially in North America, because we're basically so mired in the shit that the powers that be have us in at the moment. And in our global coastal event, whether this is a manifestation or a collective psychosis of that we're trapped in our data that was also seen by the RV guys that drew the meteor in, and is really a desperate attempt to get us out from underneath the sway of the powers that be, it doesn't really matter. Our data sets reflected an emerging view of potential reality, I guess you'd have to say, that includes a lot of this element, a lot of these things here. We didn't have anything, for instance, showing people going and getting seeds out of the seed vault. Our data set just none of it ever came up. It's kind of like the remote viewing. If you don't see it, it doesn't mean it's not there, but it just means you're not looking at it. So it could be behind you and you never pay attention to it, or it could be buried under something that obscures it to you from your view. And we would have this with our work as well, where one huge linguistics set would basically subsume another set that had similar characteristics. And this masking effect makes you a little bit temporally blind within those sets, so as to which may hit first. I can give specific examples, but they're not pertinent at the moment. But so in any event, here we are, we're after the global coastal event, and our narrative that we have from our perspective up here that emerged from our data that had been plumped up and magnified and filled in and patched over by the remote viewing stuff from the farsight.org, and then that had been further had a solid foundation put in it by the remote viewing validation studies, would suggest that our narrative begins with a giant earthquake that affects us here. We've had big earthquakes all the time. But this big earthquake is isolating, and it's isolating to the extent that it may, for instance, remove all of our electricity output from the rest of North America, which would hit California pretty hard, I think. And I have no way of knowing if our earthquakes trigger further earthquakes in California. The way that the validation study was done, it was locally focused, so it doesn't really extend beyond our immediate concerns here. And let me also state that I've been through a number of natural disasters all around the planet, and one of the first things that happens is that your view becomes extremely local, so that when you get hit by a natural disaster here, wherever you are, you don't care really about anything that's going on 5 miles away even. You've got to get up and figure out how to do dishes and all of this stuff without the usual support from your infrastructure, and it really drains your day. So this is all understandable. The remote viewing focus provided very little information about the rest of the planet. And there was some level of inference that I will apparently be able to make from the language of the remote viewing in combination with our work that seems to suggest that our isolation doesn't mean that the rest of the country loses electricity, that there are parts of the grid that do survive. Our isolation does mean that there's some level of time, could be weeks, months, days, years even, decades. We just do not know. We have no way of knowing, but there is some serious level of isolation that occurs here such that the Pacific Northwest basically is just simply not participating. And this includes Vancouver all the way up to southern Alaska, and may include all of Alaska. We just don't know. But we're just not participating in the rest of the activities in North America at the geopolitical level. It may be that there are none, but I don't know. It could be that they are, and they're just not visible to us because of our isolation, which is the result of all the bridges falling and the cables going and all of this kind of thing. And we've got a real ton of work up here to rebuild and all kinds of damage. And one thing that we do know from the validation study and from our work and from the inferring it from the farsight.org is that there is no outside assistance that comes. We're left to fend for ourselves, which probably doesn't mean the rest of the world doesn't like us. It probably means the rest of the world is in its own, otherwise occupied with its own interests. And so they can't come and give us a hand here. And with our geographic regions, we are somewhat isolated, absent the big interstates and so on. So we can make a lot of inferences. So at that point, within the data set, we have some small level of stuff that goes out maybe to July, showing the water starting to creep into Puget Sound and causes problems here. And we have evacuation and other issues ongoing here. Lots of problems relative to humans being injured in the quakes and no infrastructure to deal with it. And it just, of course, compounds itself as the infrastructure is not there day after day after day after day. And certain things must occur as we start moving fairly rapidly into a degraded weather condition. Now, that's one of the things that we sort of need to discuss here, is that the global coastal event, as a side effect to it, or as a central component for us later on, is that there's this degraded weather condition such that we, unfortunately, appear to hit something of I don't want to say a cold wall, but our data showed some kind of a weather disruption that hit us in Pacific Northwest in the August-September timeframe, while we're in the midst of all of these other issues. And so it became really a big issue and led to local diaspora. That is to say, people later in summer, early fall, will attempt to walk out of our region, forced to by circumstances. And that's as far as our data sets really went in a local area, forecasting anything that specific. We have some things we can infer. Now, basically, the whole point of the Wujo here is for you to get as much of the words and the ideas that we have relative to the global coastal event, should it occur. Bear in mind, this is science fiction. I don't want anybody to buy into this idea that it must occur. We think there's a probability, but it's unknown. We just don't know. There's all kinds of weird stuff here, and I can cite evidence that it probably will occur, but let's just assume for a moment that it does. Then we can assume a few more things. If, in fact, it was caused by an expansion event, as opposed to a meteor or something, then there's some weird effects that will exist over the next forever. Okay, and those are, the Earth will be bigger. We'll have more winds. The air will be heavier. Everything will be heavier. There'll be more gravity around. If that's the case, and we have the global coastal event, regardless of its cause, there's going to be huge levels of radiation all over. And people will probably shift around and move as a result of that. But we can also postulate that the nuke plants and everything left out to run amok are going to cause all kinds of mutation. And we indeed did see that within our data sets. In the very long-term data sets, it showed that there were whole new forms of life popping up all over in the 2018 and onward time period. Insects especially, the mutation in insects that were just truly phenomenal. We have data in our sets that went to the idea that, and this is one of the reasons I think it is an expansion event, there were some of these weird things that, as I'm a sailor, so I would pick it out. And some of the things about the winds and how sailboats would have to be totally redesigned to deal with the winds we were going to have, because the winds would be denser, lower to the water. And so the high aspect sail rigs were out because all these boats were going to be knocked over. And the response to the global coastal event included a plethora of new designs, just a renaissance of new forms of windborne propulsion. A lot of them based on even ground effect, because the air is so much denser that they could even achieve small levels of lift at slower speeds. So very interesting kind of stuff, which, I speculated, well, there's more weight in the air, so to speak, because it's able to support more, thus more gravity around and so on. We have a situation where the data suggested that there was both ice intrusion into the ocean, such as off Antarctica, but at the same time we were moving into an ice age. And so all the water vapor in the air was condensing in the form of snow and ice, not rain. After this initial flush, so to speak, of all this rainwater, the rest of it started coming down as we went in towards more cool conditions into snow and ice, and it started glaciers forming in all kinds of places, all not necessarily at all related to the poles. So that was an interesting thing out of that. We did show the sea level changes, whether it was the ice shifting off Antarctica, that kind of a thing, or whether it was new lands rising, I don't know. But it was such that we're not talking overtopping, we're not talking waves over the tops of mountains or 5,000-foot high waves or any of that kind of stuff. We're talking about basically the tide comes in along the coast, only it don't go out, and it comes in a few feet more, and then a few feet more the next day, and a few feet more the next day. And if you happen to live on the coast, well, 6 days later you've got to move, because that tide has now totally filled your basement, if you had one, and is pushing on your driveway. So we've got all of those kind of things going on. But that really was that scenario there mispaints the picture in terms of how the data set showed it, because our data set showed people leaving the coast rapidly, and that this effect would occur rapidly in a lot of areas. Not here in Puget Sound, though. In Puget Sound and the areas that I happen to cite all the time, Puget Sound and Finland, the sea areas here were such that, and the North Sea even, were such that it crept in slower. But that's not to say that that was the case in Florida or along the eastern seaboard, because they are going to be hit by apparently tsunami waves, not displacement waves. On the other hand, it does appear that the impacts from the farsight.org in Antarctica and along the coast of along the eastern coast of Africa are displacement waves, and yet our data sets show tsunami effects along Africa and from the Atlantic side and Latin America. So it may be both. Maybe we have a meteor that sets off volcanoes that causes the tsunamis at the same time that there's displacement waves going. In any event, that's basically where our data sets stop, and then we can start doing some levels of speculation based on some of the further data that we had in the very skimpy long-term stuff that came through. We did always have a long-term data set that went out to about 2041 or 2050, something in there. And it showed certain different kinds of, but it wasn't detailed. We get all of our details out of the immediacy data. And so basically the long-term, in the way our process works, the long-term data would be a framework in which the short-term data would fill in a lattice, and the lattice of the short-term data would be skinned over with detail by the immediacy data. And now all we've got is immediacy data, so we don't really have any changes in the structure of any of this. So we don't know, for instance, in our data sets for the last 2.5 years, because of the significant changes, if there have been changes in the framework that the long-term data supplied. That's why there's ambiguity as to whether or not the global coastal events will occur as if it's the same condition, because that data set didn't stop growing, but it was subsumed in the short-term data 2.5 years ago. And then our short-term data was subsumed into immediacy data 1.25 years ago, something like that. And so we've been just drowning in detail that doesn't have any of the supporting framework that allows us to really put it into position. Thus, we have certain levels of ambiguity. Nonetheless, when we last left the long-term framework, global coastal event was really solidly described after a number of years of growing data sets. I've never seen a data set, by the way, show up, grow, and then disappear. We've seen data sets that have shown up and grown and seemingly stopped growing, and we make a forecast on them, and then whoops, they don't manifest, and the next run or the run after that, the data set starts growing again, as though for whatever reason there was a hiatus in its in the accumulation of words around that particular set, and we don't know why it behaves that way. That is not an artifact of the programming. And we've even done deterministic studies and determined that these data sets are basically quiescent or paused for some period of time, and then they grow again. So again, not knowing why that occurred, we can speculate and have theories, but it's seemingly it's useless at the moment to waste the energy that way. And instead, we just have to look at it as a potential duality here. There's a framework that within our data that was forecasting the global coastal event. We have all kinds of manifesting evidence all around the planet that it indeed is on. Everything from earthquakes, volcanoes, meteors, the actions of the powers that be, the banking system run amok, seed vaults, sinkholes, new cracks in the planet, and so on and so on and so on. So there's every reason to believe that we're heading right to the global coastal event as has been described all these years in our data sets. Now, if this is the case, then we're going to experience the earthquake up here, and after that, from the rest of the planet's viewpoint, there's isolation from us. Doesn't mean YouTube doesn't exist, but it may mean that there's no participation for a number of years from the Northwest because we don't have internet service. I don't know. It may indeed mean that all the servers on the planet go down for some period of time. That would seem to be a logical understanding of some of the damage levels that were shown in our data and were shown in the validation studies at all. So we're presupposing that the level of isolation and damage that hits us is confirmatory of the diaspora as seen by the farsight.org as people evacuate the coasts all around. Since most people live around the coasts, that means most of the planetary infrastructure is damaged, and thus the more dire part of our forecast of 1.289 billion people that die does make sense under those circumstances over some period of time. And this is basically our narrative. Now, sort of the good news for me is that I survive at least the initial earthquake insofar as the validation studies are concerned. This could be good or bad depending on how nasty it gets later. But in any event, there won't be communication from us. We're not going to have ham radios, that kind of thing, because atmospherics are going to change at a huge level, not only with gravity, but also with all of the crap that's going to be put in the air by the volcanoes and such. And that's sort of where we're at. If we're accurate, all this starts to occur before June 1. The earthquake happens up here before June 1, whatever it is that initiates the global coastal event, and it may not be associated with the earthquake. It may be that we get a pulse from the sun and we get an earthquake up here, and then 3 or 4 days later we coincidentally get hit by a meteor, and that our earthquake is in no way associated with directly with what precipitates the global coastal event. Or it could be that our global coastal event is caused by our earthquakes escalating around the planet until a big chunk of ice falls off Antarctica. Whatever it is that is the cause seems to be less of an issue at the moment, although all of our minds tend to focus on it. And as I began this Wujo, when I'm sitting here and I'm quiet and the sun's out and I'm having a bit of tea on the deck out here, and the hummingbirds are thrumming by my head as they head over towards the feeders, and the fishes are making all kinds of noises, and the eagles are off circling in the distance, and my crows are bitching like mad that the eagles are off circling in the distance. It makes sense to think of next week and the week after and the week after that as being a continuation of this current day, this current time, this current moment, and that our plans could actually mature and could actually pan out. But I've lived long enough with the data set that, unfortunately, to a certain extent, I'm sure it's a mental illness, I have to stop and say, well, no point in doing it. No point in making those moves. No point in, getting this, that, or the other thing done. Because it just won't make any difference. If this forecast is even accurate by 1%, the impacts are going to be so severe that certain things will change forever. And so it's not really worth worrying about this, that, and the other thing. And basically I'm hoping, as I say, and I'll probably be hope that is, as usual, filled in results in disappointment, but I'm hoping that we'll reach June 1, and I can basically say retire that whole data set and just assume I'm going to have to spend the rest of my life fighting the fascist bastards. But I can go about making certain plans and doing things that have been otherwise hamstrung by years of working on this data set up to this particular point, focusing not really on the global coastal event, because the data our work never really started that way, but it just kind of evolved over time that had a tendency to dominate everything. And it's just like, wow, I sure hope it goes away. We'll know real soon. My way of thinking is that by May 26th, if we haven't had the earthquake here, the likelihood of it occurring depreciates very rapidly from that day forward. So the likelihood of the farsight.org version of what I call the global coastal event also, in my mind, starts decreasing very rapidly from May 26th onward. It could happen in those few days between May 26th and June 1, but I have reasons to think that will not be the case. Nonetheless, though, by June 1, I'll make a whole new set of plans and have an entirely new lease on life and a new set of energy and so on, assuming that we have not had our global coastal event. Now, the point of this Wujo was to assume that it did occur. And so by June 1, if it does occur, we're in a situation here where we've been devastated by an earthquake and we're still without electricity, and we're beginning to realize that there won't be food deliveries. There won't be fuel deliveries, and we better start getting our butts in gear and getting ready for winter. Now, of course, I'm going to be super paranoid and aware of that ahead of time, but because I've been prepared for all of this. But a lot of the people in our area will not be so ready. And unfortunately, at some point, decisions are apparently made, and lots of us decide to walk out of the region. Others, I think, and I don't know where I will be on this, are going to take different approaches to what's going on. It's going to be dependent on whether, I think, in terms of the some of the data sets way back when, for instance, showed that a lot of the people that were walking out of this region were doing so because they had something that drew them. They had, family outside of the area that they could potentially get to, or they thought there was rescue outside the region if they got to it, that sort of thing. In spite of all indicators that government was not around and there wouldn't be a federal government even if you were able to walk out of the state to one of the neighboring states, nonetheless, people were attempting to do just that, or setting out to do just that. From that point on, I've got a lot of things to do today, as may be expected. I'm still earthquake-proofing the house and so on. But let's shift all the narrative back out of my perspective onto you at this stage, whoever you, the listener, may be. So you're going to have to think, okay, this is Clif's narrative and others. There are other people involved in this, the remote viewers, the scientists that are working on the escalating earthquake issues, and so on. All kinds of people are throwing information that can be taken in the gestalt, in the zeitgeist, and say, okay, there seems to be a general trend line that one could point to an interdisciplinary coherence around the idea of some form of earth changes that are going to cause big disruptions. That Clif's narrative is labeled the global coastal event, which, by the way, I really screwed up. I shouldn't have used the word event. I should have used global coastal process or phenomenon or something. In any event, though, because it's ongoing, it goes on for a number of years. Let's say that we're accurate with our narrative. Then basically it comes down to, what is your narrative going to be? Where you live, what are you going to have to deal with? What circumstances are going to dominate your life? They will cascade, by the way, having been through natural disasters where the infrastructure is removed from you, then there are certain things you can anticipate. If you're at home and the natural disaster strikes and you have no electricity, your focus is going to go from point to point to point to point based on your daily routine breaking down. The inability to wash clothes, do dishes, get warm, cook food, all of these things will focus your attention repeatedly locally. Now, if you're trapped out in the sense that you were traveling while this occurs, then many people's focus will be entirely on getting back to what they presume to be home, which they may think of as being still safe, warm, and able to have food and clean dishes and clothes and stuff. And the alteration of that thinking over time changes. At some point, about 11 days into a natural disaster, if you don't have to evacuate, you can be somewhat settled in the new conditions. But this kind of a process, as has been described by our data sets and this sort of thing, will alter your narrative, because you can't assume that the conditions that will prevail 11 days out, 22 days out, 66 days out are going to be anything close to what you may think of as an evolution from the state. In other words, within our global coastal event data and so forth, there's pointers to some areas where your narrative may be changing literally week by week as the disaster continues to unfold. So, for instance, if your narrative is that you think you're going to be able to withstand the lack of electricity and grow food in your environment because you're not going to be subjected to volcanoes, and the ash shouldn't be a big deal, and you should have enough sunlight, and you're good at it, you can can food with your old wood cook stove and so on, you may find that one thing you hadn't anticipated was the shutdown of the nuclear plant 52 miles away from you, and the evacuation of a region of about 100 miles in diameter, as everybody starts basically worrying, are they becoming ill from nuclear radiation? Those kind of things. Or maybe it'll be a wave of refugees that'll be coming at you from some distant point that have made it out of their area, forced out by some nuclear plants or these kind of things. So basically from this point on, my message is flexibility. That the anti-fragile, those beings that become more improved by adversity, those are the kind of things that are going to survive in this coming environment should the global coastal event happen, because everything changes from that point forward. even if it's a minor one, as I say, even if it's only a planetary crack and no meteors or any of that, nonetheless, that's such a huge, significant change that life evolves for everyone radically from that point forward in entirely different directions. And the anti-fragile are going to be those people that will get pummeled, get stronger, and get up. As long as you have a recovery period, you can do this. That's going to be our real issue during this period of time, is the recovery. So we're going to have to watch and guard ourselves, because we'll be subjected to natural disaster unfolding as the global coastal event that in some people's local environment will alter their perception of what's going on, because it'll be a shift weeks later into fleeing due to nuclear events. In others, it may be that they're reasonably well off, isolated by woods environment. You know, you live on a lake in the deep woods in the British Columbia, and there's the earthquake shakes the lake a bit, but you're used to living without electricity. You fish out of the lake. You've got food for a year anyway. You can hunt vast quantities of wilderness, so you're not really worried until the place starts burning and you realize, uh-oh, that's not a volcano. That smells like vast quantities of Douglas fir going up in hundreds of thousands of acres all around it, and it's moving towards me. And there's nobody up there to put fires out, and nobody even trying. And also there's huge new sources for fires in the forms of, volcanic debris and so forth falling down. So you have those kind of issues even inland. These things could be expected to cause problems. The global coastal event, the expansion issue, could be expected to cause problems with all forms of anything buried in the ground. So if you've got electricity buried in the ground, maybe the cables will snap. And so thus, when there's maybe electricity back in some parts of your area, there won't be any in your area, because somewhere in hundreds of miles of underground cable, there's enough breaks that it just isn't going to happen, that it's going to be repaired. And even if it could be repaired, there's no cable being delivered because there's no just-in-time delivery system. And so it just gets to the point where, well, basically, if you want electricity at some point, you're going to have to rig your own system. But it may be doable in some areas. There may be recoverable resources and this kind of a thing. We don't know what the impacts are going to be in a lot of different areas, because basically our data went dark with these data holes, which are popping up all over. That again, I have to say, is not a good sign, because we had always had our global coastal event associated with a period of time after May of 2013, when our system went dark. And our system went dark because of all these data holes that turned into Swiss cheese, if you will, and became a giant data gap. And what it turns out to be is this huge level of warfare that's going on the internet now. It's causing all kinds of problems. People's servers are being taken out, routers are destroyed. It is not just us guys, it's all over the place. In fact, there's something of a surreptitious hiring boom going on for anybody that's got network defense skills at various different levels. The number of zero-day attacks is just escalating like mad. And the number of tools available for such attacks are becoming readily available and falling into less and less sophisticated hands, so that's causing a huge amount of disruption. And a lot of people are even now starting to notice. Also, it's starting to affect corporate bottom lines, like places like Netflix and other places that have to do downloading to you are in a real world of hurt, and it's starting to affect their economics because of the trying to battle through all of the DDoS attacks and other forms of attack that are ongoing. And so it's kind of an interesting situation. Our data holes would be, in a metaphoric sense, it would be as though we were free-range chicken farmers in France as World War I is starting up. And there's trenches from the French on one and British on one side, and trenches from the Germans on the other, and we're trying to get free-range chickens and gather eggs in between. Just not a tenable position when there's warfare in the overlying terrain in which both our chickens and ourselves have to do our business. And so finding these free-range eggs, our data, is becoming increasingly difficult as we're also dodging bullets. And this was seen in our data sets from way back in probably about 2005. It really firmed up, and we started calling it the data gap around that time. But the data gap is really showing up here in a very unexpected way. Now we may end up with the data gap being more or less permanent as undersea cables rip and this kind of thing, assuming a global coastal event happens, which is the point of this particular WUJO. If that's the case, of course, you can see there won't be intercontinental shipments. There won't be, oh, and also, by the way, if there's a global coastal event, there's going to be all kinds of damage to the shipping infrastructure around the planet. Even if ships are in ports, they can be expected to be severely damaged. Also, by the way, there won't be fueling for boats because a lot of the fuel situations are assuming that our ports are static and don't have to deal with water retreating or water overtaking them. So not a good time. There will also be chemical pollution everywhere from all these coastal-based chemical operations. That's another reason people flee is the chemical pollution. This is especially true in some of the data sets that we had for California. A lot of people fleeing the coast there because of chemical plant activity. And once the chemical plants are disrupted by the global coastal event and lack of electricity and infrastructure, and there's no firefighting capability, it got rather severe. And so people just took off. Where they're headed, I don't know. They're just moving to get out of the way of the current circumstances. I laugh about this because I'm totally insane by this point. But also, what are you going to do? You can't stop it. There's nothing that can be done about it. You can prepare as much as you want, and the universe can come along and change your plans in a minute by having a 75-mile-an-hour wind in the form of a tornado, lift your butt up, strip your clothes off, and throw you naked or in your underwear in a mud pile 30 miles away with amnesia. And so much for all your preparations. Okay, and so, excuse me, that's basically where we're at. We have if we have the global coastal event, take our little science fiction running piece here, take those pieces that are likely to affect your local area, and postulate really bizarre things happening, and frame your narrative of what you might have to deal with within that science fiction of those really bizarre things happening. Because here's the thing, guys. Our global coastal event stuff was for sure after. We never had a time on it. The only reason we have a time now is entirely due to the remote viewing. Our global coastal event was always after our data gap formed up, but we knew our data gap formed up by May of 2013, but we had no temporal distance between there and the global coastal event. Could have been a day, could have been 5 years, just no way of knowing. Now we know it's within the month of May itself during this process of the data gaps forming up from the Swiss cheese effect and the data holes. But the whole point of all of this is that the long look data that we had showed space aliens showing up. It showed the future pop of the North America having to deal with parts of North America being colonized by space aliens, and that there was basically an ongoing antagonistic relationship between the Gulf states guys, the water tribes, and these space aliens. And the thing that kept the water tribes safe, if you will, was that this particular group of space aliens they were dealing with didn't like messing about on the water. And so they would have a tendency to just leave these areas alone. But there was skirmishing, if you will, going on. Because these probably Cajun people did not like the space aliens taking over their territory and resented it, and so they gave these space aliens a little bit of hurt, and it kind of antagonized the relationship. But this is not limited to North America. It's just that we had the most accurate description of the situation in North America, but that there was apparently some form of colonization ongoing on Earth by species that are extraterrestrial. I don't know if they're human-like. I don't know if they look like, giant squid in spacesuits. I have no way of knowing because we didn't get that level of description. We just know that they were described as space aliens, and that there was this alien wars that was ongoing as a result of this colonization attempt. So really interesting. Hey, if we're going to have a global coastal event, may as well have the space aliens land afterwards and get into an Independence Day scenario. In any event, guys, it's This is probably the very last Wujo that I'll be able to get out. I've got a lot of things I need to get done, and Universe has not been very cooperative with the health of people around me, which took a lot of my energy and delayed my plans. As I say, Universe decides this, not us. But good luck to everybody. I hope I'm 100% wrong and that we don't get a global coastal event. I'm going to go and retire into my insanity and and come up with some new crap as of June 1. If that's the case. Otherwise, if that's not the case, there certainly won't be any Wujos. There won't even be any updates to vast quantities of the internet. And the life will really change as a result of a global coastal event happening. Probably what Universe wants, though. I've got a friend of mine who faced some rough times, and like I told him, no matter what you do, if a Universe wants you to go to prison, you'll end up in prison. Been there, seen that, fought that. Don't make no difference at all. Basically, Universe is ruling. The sun is a comet. We're debris. Our planet is debris being drugged behind that comet. And we're the critters trying to live in the dirt on the debris behind the comet. So we don't have a whole lot of control about anything, not even the quality of the dirt we're trying to live on. Good luck to us all. I'm sure humans are going to survive this if it occurs, because for whatever reason, Universe really likes us. It's kept us going this long. And there's quite a few good humans to like, and that's kind of cool. Like I say, though, good luck, guys. That's probably the last one.